should go live. All right, cool. So here we go, y'all. So I want to give us a functional demo of how this React stuff works with relationship to building out more functional pieces of code. So to do that, I'm going to make use of a Tic Tac Toe game that we built in a couple sessions ago and use it as an opportunity to talk through a couple important points on how we work with, how we can convert this HTML to React, but also just some other functional little dev things that are going to be helpful for you to know in your own coding journey. So I'm actually going to start by taking us to GitHub, right? And in GitHub right now, I have a version of a Tic Tac Toe game that I built out in just HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, right? I built this a while ago, but we can still see that the code is doing some really interesting stuff. So first, let's just do a quick code review. And if you are like me, you might have followed the tutorial on Medium, the super dope tutorial that walks through like how to create tic-tac-toe in JavaScript, HTML, CSS. I'll put a link to this again for y'all. But essentially what we built was a very functional HTML, CSS, and JavaScript version of tic-tac-toe. As you can see, here's all the HTML code here. We have a simple kind of HTML document. The head has a couple different little meta tags, but more specifically, it has a link to a CSS sheet, style sheet, as well as a script tag. And the body has a couple things that allow for us to have our tic-tac-toe game. We have some text for the user to see. We have this big div that contains another pretty big div that has our squares for our board, right? So this top level div is our board. And I also added a little reset button to the game at the end. So pretty simple HTML, right? And then we had also, let me go back to the files, right? We had a CSS file that was connected. You saw that there was a link to the CSS file in the HTML. The CSS just has a little bit of CSS that allows for our squares to render correctly, our board to show as like a square 9x9 grid, right? And each of the squares to have some border around it so that we actually see our board, right? So just a little bit of CSS here to just make the board actually look like a board. And finally, we have a JavaScript file that we used in order to, do the logic, all the logic of the game itself. So here you can see in this JavaScript file, right, created a winning combos array. We created some variables to represent our board, represent whose turn it was, represent if somebody won, who won. We had to create some references to the different parts of our HTML. So to get all the squares back, as well as to then create those event handling functions that would allow for us to click on the board and swap the message, etc. All types of interesting things there. We had a couple functions, I think 4 functions here. One function that looks to check if there's a winner of our game. It uses that array of combinations in order to say, hey, did somebody win the game? So we had that get winner function that ran through to see if somebody won. We have a handle turn function that whenever the board got clicked, we called this handle turn function. And what that handle turn function did was updated our board with whoever's turn it was, and essentially tried to check if there was a winner. So every turn we would check if there's a winner. If there was, we would return who the winner was. If there wasn't, then we would just create a new version of the board by calling this render function. The initialize function just sets our board up as an empty board and renders it on the screen. And then our render function is really what goes through to mark the board up with any of the text content that we need, as well as, hey, if somebody won, we would show, hey, you know, someone won the game, or hey, it's a tie, like, etc. Right? So all the logic is in this JavaScript here, and the HTML is the structure, and the CSS is the style sheet. So what I am going to do is actually get a version of this code for me to then talk through how we might redo this using React, and just making this more of a React version of a project as opposed to this vanilla JavaScript version of the project. So to do that, I'm going to also introduce us to another really interesting thing that we can do with Git-based projects, which is clone these projects, right? So whether it's my project or another project on GitHub, you have the ability to clone Git projects to your computer in order to work with them. And so in this case, I have this file on my computer, but I wanted to show you all this anyway, because I think it's just helpful to know how to do this. But essentially, if you go to any repo on GitHub, right, you have the opportunity to clone that repo to your local machine. So cloning a repo is pretty simple. You go to the repository on GitHub, click the green button for code, and you'll see the URL connected to that particular repository. If you copy this link to that repository, whether you use HTTPS or SSH, you know, you want to just go based on which one you use, copy that link to that particular repository, and then in your terminal and in your you can clone that repository. So if I were to set this up as a new little project for myself, well, sometimes what I'll do is I will go to VS Code, create a new window, and when it opens, I'll open up a new terminal. And then I will, inside of the terminal is where we got to do the git clone stuff. So typically I use the terminal to find the place where I want to save this code. So I can do that in a number of different ways. I could CD and then go into a directory that I have created. In this case, like I said, I like to keep a projects folder on my root directory. So I can just go to CD projects, and inside of here, I can eventually run the command. And let me move this out the way for y'all. I can run the command git clone with that particular URL. So by running the git clone, what this is going to do is it's going to clone into that project and get all of the source code as a file on my computer in that particular folder that I created. So another way to do this would be if I wanted to create my own folder, right? I could go to VS Code, create a new folder. So go here, create open folder, and then in VS Code, I could create a new folder for myself and essentially open that folder and then run the terminal code in there, right? So that would be the same as if I did something like new project, right? And then open this new project folder up in VS Code. By doing it this way, VS Code actually will be more helpful because it'll show all of the files inside of this current folder that I have. But I could still open up the terminal and then do like I just did when it finally loads, which is git clone and paste the link here. Since I opened the folder already, you can see that it will open up with that file here, and now I can work with the project here in VS Code. So I actually do it this way. I opened up a new folder, clone that particular repository, and now I have access to all of the different files that came back there. So let's talk a little bit about what I want to accomplish, which is now that I have this kind of starter tic-tac-toe code, what I can do is I can actually open this up in the live server and Sorry, my VS Code is lagging a little bit. Sorry, y'all. There it is. So I'm just going to change into this directory for myself. But now that I have this open, I can, I should be able to open this in a live server, but I don't know why it is tweaking. Interesting. Well, I'll figure out the live server in a second. Either way, right, now that I have this code here, I'm able to make use of this code to start the process of talking through how we're going to make these changes. Maybe what I got to do is I'm going to open the direct folder that I cloned. And hopefully that was the issue with the server. Let's see. Yeah, cool. So I just opened that folder I cloned. You just want to make sure you open the folder that you cloned. Otherwise, you won't be able to directly call the live server. But point is, with this Tic Tac Toe folder open, right, I can now open the live server to my code. You might already have the code, so it might not even work. You might not worry too much because you already have your old one. But for those of y'all who maybe have to clone mine or something to use it, just remember to open the live server, you need to be in your project folder. So I'm just going to go ahead and open the index.html and the live server for a second, just so that we can see how the code itself runs and just familiarize ourselves with what it does. Not everybody might remember how Tic Tac Toe works, but it's just good to know in general. So this particular code is going to allow for me to play Tic Tac Toe, and y'all can see a little version that I actually worked on, which uses faces instead of X's and O's. So y'all get the point, right? But this is the game, right? It creates those squares and it allows us to play Tic Tac Toe. In the case of the code that I want to use for the sake of this example, though, I actually want to make use of an older version of my project that I worked on before I got all into the weeds of using these different spaces and all that stuff, so that it doesn't confuse y'all with like what we're working on. So this is a great opportunity to talk about how we can do that using Git and GitHub, right? So if I go back to my main, the main part of the repo, you can see actually that I had 8 commits in that particular repository, right? The last 2 were the ones where I changed my Tic Tac Toe to a different version. But there's a particular commit here before I got into all of that I actually want to go back to and check out, right? And remember, I told y'all that the value of using Git is that you can go back to previous versions of the code that you're working on. So to do that, you just need to know what is the commit version of this particular code that you want to go back to. And in my case, I can see it here on GitHub. It has like a copy to copy that particular commit value. But also, if I were in VS Code and I opened up the terminal here, I could do a git log in here, and that will allow me to look through all of the commits as well. So clearly the commit that I want to go to is this one, update main.js. It has this very long commit hash associated with it. If I copy this little value, this hash value here, I can use Git to check out old versions of the code prior to, to basically see the versions before any of these changes were made. To do that, I use a command in Git called checkout. So let me just clear the terminal. So I can use Git checkout and pass that commit value in order to go back to an older version of my code in Git. By doing that, right, this code just updated. And so now I would expect that if I go back to my Tic Tac Toe, like you can see, it actually went back to my old original version of Tic Tac Toe, where it's just X's and O's, right? And so this is the version I actually wanted to use to make use of in the code. So I'm gonna just make it go off of that so that the code is familiar to y'all, and it's not like, well, how did you do that stuff with the pictures and that's everything else. So that's that. The second thing is I wanted to introduce you to another common practice that we use when we're making changes to code that we've already worked on. And that is to use what we call branches in Git and GitHub in order to essentially separate like the previous version of the code with a different version. A branch essentially takes a snapshot of the code at a specific point in time, and it gives you a new space to work on that code and not worry about, hey, is this going to mess up the previous version of the code that I had, or the previous history of the code that I had, right? So whereas on GitHub, I currently only have one branch. It's called master. By creating a new branch, I can have an entirely different set of code history that uses, that doesn't need to conflict with this one. So to do that, what I'm gonna do is just go ahead and create a new branch. I'm gonna call it development. So I'm gonna say git checkout, and the command to create a new branch is, let me just clear this so y'all can see it. The command to create a new branch is checkout, git checkout, and we use the -B to create a new branch. And in this case, I'm just gonna create a new branch called development. So you see, switch to a new branch, development. And the important thing to know about how branches work is that whatever version of the code you were on when you created the branch is going to be the version of the code that this branch has as a starting point. So I went back a version to my code and then created this version, this development branch, so that now my development branch also will have still the same kind of tic-tac-toe code running, and I can make changes to it that way. So I did all this as a little pre-setup in order to then now make a bunch of changes to this particular code base and introduce using React in it and all this stuff without having to like mess up the version I had previously that was just working with regular HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So two very important pieces of information to know about using Git. One is that you can clone repositories, clone different repositories that you might have or somebody else might have worked on. And then two is that you can check out and create new branches to using the checkout as well. So checkout will let you go back to a version of a commit. It also will let you create a new branch if you use the -B to create a new branch. And so that's just a little bit of Git food for y'all who are trying to get your Git knowledge up. But now that we have this version of the tic-tac-toe, and it's the same version that I went through in GitHub, so we don't actually have to spend too much time reviewing the code. It's the same thing that I was showing y'all earlier today. Now that we have a clean version that we can fully mess up, it's time to start messing it up and think about, well, how can we actually turn this from a regular kind of CSS, JavaScript, HTML-like project into one that is going to use React? And to do that, it's really going to be a matter of understanding, well, what does React do for us that HTML, CSS, and JavaScript needs to adapt to, right? Well, there's a couple things that React does. The first thing is React is going to make it possible for us to define all of this visual elements of the code as JavaScript pieces of data, so JSX, right? So instead of having to create this whole tic-tac-toe board using regular HTML, I can also create this tic-tac-toe board using JavaScript and making it so that the JavaScript is responsible for the board for creating those visual elements. The second thing that React does for us is it will make it so that all of the logical stuff that we're doing, so all the stuff that's going on in the main.js, we'll be able to tie to the same JavaScript components and elements. So all of these JavaScript right now is kind of just externally connecting to a lot of things and doing this logic for the game, et cetera, right? With React, we can actually build the JSX and the JavaScript logic for that JSX in the same place, in the same components, in the same files. So we might be able to get away with, instead of having this main.js and the index so separated, we can bundle it a little bit better using React. So there's a couple of steps that we're going to follow in order to get this thing working physically with React. We're going to speed through and walk through them together right now, but I really encourage you to make it a thing for yourself to do this on your own Tic Tac Toe project or a similar project, so that you can get a sense for how does React save you from having to do some of the stuff you had to do before to get things working. So with that, if you're ready to rock with me, ready to dive into this React, just give me a quick thumbs up so I know that y'all awake and then fall asleep on your boy, and we're gonna get this thing popping. We're gonna get the show on the road. All right, thank you. Cool. Fire. All right, so step one in turning this into a React project, right? Step one, we have to update this HTML in order to use React, right? Right now, this HTML is just using regular HTML and CSS and JavaScript. There's nothing about this that says, hey, I'm using React. So a couple things we have to do in order to make this project React ready, right? And it goes back to a little bit of what we were talking about. I'm gonna pull back up our old code just so that we can familiarize ourselves with it, right? When we were working with our simple React project, there was a couple small things we had to do. First thing was we had to, one, bring in all these little React scripts and stuff. And then the second thing was we had to create like kind of this entry point into our React, for our React application to work. Those are the two steps you need to do to make your HTML ready to use React. So in our code, what I want to do is create that entry point for the React, and then also bring in those React scripts that were going to allow us to say, hey, we're using React in this particular project. So what I'm going to do is in the body, just now, for now, I'm just going to do it at the top. I'm going to create a div, an empty div, and I'm going to give it ID, and the ID is going to be called root for now. The ID could really be called anything, right? In the other version, I called it app, but I'm going to use the word app later, so I just decided to name it root. Just to make my life a little bit easier. Now, if I save this, right, nothing's gonna change with relationship to our Tic Tac Toe game, right? That didn't really change anything that we would have expected to see, because, right, this div is empty. There's nothing in there, right? If I start to add some code in here and I say, hey, right, like now I'm gonna see some visual stuff because now that div has some text in it. But for now, I don't actually want this div to say anything. I just want it to be empty, because this is where we're going to tell React, hey, you're going to put code inside of this div, right? And we'll see what code it does in a second. So that's step one, right? Is make sure we add that entry point to our code. So I'm going to say add React entry point, right? I'm going to call it root. So there we go, right? The next thing we need to do is we need those scripts that we've talked about before that allow us to connect our project to React, right? There's a couple of different scripts that we use that have the React, the important React libraries that allow for us to set up a new React project, right? Those three scripts, and I'll send a link to them as well so that y'all have them easy to access, are these three scripts that we have before. So I'm just going to copy them. Again, I'll send a note that has them for y'all so that it's easy to remember where they are. But essentially the two scripts, there's three scripts. Two of them are like React library scripts. So you can see React version 17, React development. And then you see this one, React DOM 17, React DOM development. And then we have this other script for Babel, which allows for us to write JSX and have the JSX interpreted by HTML. Either way is we need all three of these scripts. So I'm just going to copy that and go back to this nice little project that we're working on. Now, in the old project that you just saw, I had those scripts inside of the body. But in the case of how we were structuring this little tic-tac-toe game, we were actually putting a lot of scripts in the head. in this case, because these scripts are just connecting to some external JavaScript libraries for us, we actually can just put them in wherever we want. We can put them in the head or put them in the body. In my case, I'm gonna just put them in the head because I have a nice little section, a nice little comment section here for this is where we link up to the JS, where I'll just put those 3 scripts there. So now I have the 3 scripts that I need, as well as that entry point for the React code here. So quick thumbs up if this is making sense to you, kind of what I'm doing right now, just making sure I connect to the React libraries externally, and then also have the entry point for the React there as well. Cool. If you have a question, feel free to drop it in the chat though, and we'll keep it rocking. So you need this entry point, and we'll see why in a second. But we also need these script tags in order to make sure that our HTML knows, hey, we're going to be using some of the React library in our code right now. Awesome. So here's where things get interesting, right? We have a JavaScript file that is doing a lot of stuff, right? It has a lot of logic inside of it, and it's really all the logic we need to build Tic Tac Toe is inside of here. And then inside of our HTML, all of the visual components that we need are here. So, because remember, this was already a complete Tic Tac Toe game. We already did it, right? That was done. So now it's just a matter of like, well, how do I reactify this? How do I do this in React? And rather than like kind of just do it all from scratch and, you know, reinvent the wheel, I would just rather take what we already had working, but make it work in a React project instead of making it work in regular HTML and CSS and JavaScript. To do that, what I'm going to do is just create another file, another JavaScript file to work off of, so that I'm not conflicting with this one main.js, right? So in my project, I actually created a JavaScript folder. You might not have one in yours. You might just have the main.js just in your big project folder. Either way, it's fine. Just make sure inside of your project folder somewhere, you create a new file for yourself. In my case, I'm going to call it app. I'm going to call it app.js for now. And note, I gave it a capital letter because the app.js is actually going to be a component that I'm going to create. And I'm going to use that component in order to essentially create the infrastructure for us to create a new component in JSX. And all components in JSX follow a very simple premise. They're functions. So you can use the function keyword, you can use arrow syntax, whatever way you're comfortable with, but I'm just going to create a very simple JavaScript function that hopefully all of us can see. This is just a JavaScript function, right? The function name, I gave it with a capital A, app. This is one part that symbolizes that this is going to be a React component, is that we're using a capital letter for this function here. All React components need to do is return some JSX. So now that I'm in a JavaScript file, right? Remember, I got to return this in a JavaScript. This is all JavaScript. So everything I'm writing here has to be JavaScript enabled. In this case, right, even if I'm like, okay, well, I know I want to return maybe a little div with some stuff in here, right? I'm going to show y'all real quick. Just fix this, right? I'm just going to create a little simple version of the app. And then here, I'm going to say H1, and I'm going to say Tic React Toe. Get it? Tic React Toe. Y'all like, all right, chill, just finish the code. I got you, say less. But anyway, right? This little function is returning what looks like HTML. But remember, because we're talking about JavaScript, because we're talking about React, this is no longer HTML, right? Now, this is actually JSX. And in the React space, right? JSX allows for us to write these HTML looking like elements, but they're inside of a JavaScript file, right? We're no longer in our HTML file, right? To create a React component, and to render a React component in our project, the first thing we have to do is create a component or create some JSX, right? And the next thing we have to do is we have to add a line to render this component onto the React DOM. So the React DOM, remember, is a library that we brought in the HTML. Remember, we brought in 3 libraries. One of them is React DOM. And the React DOM library is what allows for us to call this function without it being like, well, where is this coming from? Well, it's coming from that library that we brought in to our HTML. The React DOM render function literally takes in a component or some JSX and the place in the HTML document where this component in JSX will be rendered. So in my case, the component, I just wrote one, is this app, right? And remember, it'd be like app, and then we would put where in the HTML do we want this to render? Well, remember, we created that little entry point in our body, this div with the ID of root, that is the perfect place for us to pass this. So I'm just going to say root. And the interesting thing is, for this to work, right, I need to ensure that this is a component. And so to do that, I have to call it with the syntax for JSX, which is something along these lines. So now this one file is going to create a new component for me, and it's going to render that component into the root of that particular HTML document. If I save this and I save this, we should see this update and give us a green light. And I think the thing I'm missing here is, sorry, y'all. What am I missing here? I get it. Okay. So we're not seeing anything come up here essentially, right? And the reason why is very simple, right? We are calling in our code right now, we're calling a script to our main.js, but now I'm working in the app.js, right? So because I'm calling main.js, but I'm working in app.js, none of this code is actually getting called by the HTML yet. So in order to fix this, I need to just go ahead and change. This this script tag to say, instead of calling main.js, I want you to actually call my app.js, which is the code that I wrote before. And secondly, because the app.js is a React, is going to be written in JSX, I need to make sure that the type of this script knows that it is going to be, I think it is text JSX or something like this. Let me make sure. Sorry, y'all. Sorry, live coding. Yeah, text/JSX. Man, I gotta trust myself, bro. I'm lit. What am I talking about? Text/JSX, right? This will let this script tag know, okay, boom, we're gonna call this app.js, and inside of that app.js, just like we have right now, right, it might be using some JSX. That's what this type text JSX means. It's like, hey, this is a JavaScript file, but it has JSX inside of it. So make sure you know to process that with Babel. The second thing is, our old script tag was using this defer tag because it was trying to wait until the end of the all of the code loaded to run. In this case right now, I don't think it'll actually present too much of a problem for us. No, not at all. So we can keep it for now, but I'm gonna move it later. Whoops. Bet. So going back, now you can see we have this new element that got added to our screen, Tic React Toe, right? But remember, this is just an element that we kind of created with our app, our component that we created here. So now we know that our HTML is connected to React and the library is working. We have the ability to create new components and render them into our HTML. Great first step. The next step is that we need to, now that we have the React kind of working and HTML is no longer needed as much because we can do this all programmatically with JavaScript and JSX, we need to move from the HTML to the JSX, right? And to do that, we just want to make sure that now that we have this HTML being rendered directly from JSX, clearly here from lines 3 to 5, we can now actually take the HTML that we had previously in our code in the body and actually use React to run this, right? And theoretically, if React is able to process the ability for us to put this simple div in there, it should be able to take all this HTML that we wrote before and do the same thing. So I'm actually going to cut all of this HTML out of the HTML document itself, including my little button, because why would I forget you? And the only thing I'm going to leave in here is this div with the ID root. By doing this, right, I keep the fact that my app needs that entry point, right? And so I need to keep that ID root div, that empty div in there for me to allow this to work. But now with this app, instead of just returning this Tic Tac Tick React Toe, I can actually put all of my little old HTML code in here, right? I'll get rid of this H1 since I have one now. This H2, it's X's turn. All this stuff is valid, except now you can see I'm getting a little error in VS Code. First of all, shout out the fact that we're writing in a new JavaScript file, right? Now that we're writing in a JavaScript file, hopefully you see it's way easier to read all this JSX, right? Before, to compare it, right? When we were writing just regular JavaScript in an HTML document, it was not easy to read. I was feeling bad for y'all because I knew how bad it was to read, but I was like, this is going somewhere. And where it's going is here, right? Well, now we have our own file. We can, since this is a JavaScript file, VS Code is giving us a really helpful color coding. It's really showing us what's going on. The only thing, and one of the other things it's showing us is little errors, syntax errors and stuff. And here it's saying, hey, what is this? This is not JavaScript. And it's right? This is a comment in HTML, and comments in HTML don't translate to JavaScript, right? So it's just like, yo, what is this? You got to get rid of this. So I'm just going to delete this because that's not a valid JavaScript comment. JavaScript comments, just for your reference, are like dash slash slash or slash dot dot slash kind of thing, right? So that's why it was telling me, hey, that's messed up. Same thing here, right? I can actually turn this into a JavaScript comment by using the comment shortcut in VS Code, which just adds the dot slash and the curly braces. Because remember, in React, when you're adding JavaScript into JSX, all the JavaScript, even if it's a comment, has to be wrapped with a curly brace. So that's just a little bit of stuff there. Actually, I'll actually keep this just so y'all can keep seeing that. But yeah, dope. So now we have a little bit more complex stuff going on in our app.js. Let's just save it for now. And in the index.html, since I got rid of it, I'm going to save this now, right? And go back to our screen. And with the live server, you can see it reloaded. And we have literally our tic-tac-toe board still up there because it's being rendered with React. Can I get an amen from the church, or can I get some like thumbs up if y'all rocking with me? Y'all see what I'm saying here, right? React is now able to do all of the rendering of the HTML visual content for us. And that's real great because, hey, it's going to save us a lot of time. But now here comes the good part, right? Clearly, this is visually showing what it needs to show. But if I start clicking on stuff, nothing's happening based on what we had before. Again, part of the reason why is because all of the logic of what should happen in tic-tac-toe is actually happening in our main.js file. And we're now working in the app.js component. We're not working in this main.js right now. So clearly, there's a reason why those things aren't showing up. The valuable thing about React, outside of the fact that, hey, we were just able to define our entire visual elements in React here, right, is also these visual elements were styled appropriately, right? Well, why is that? Well, that's because React also allows for us to define elements with classes and IDs and all the same stuff that we would have been able to do in HTML. All these attributes, the class attribute and the ID attribute, exist in React. The only difference, and this is a small minor detail, but it is one worth noting, is if we were to open this up in the console, we're open the JavaScript console, we're going to see a bunch of little warnings in the console that are saying, hey, you know, we don't actually use this, we don't actually use this property class. Did you mean class name, right? The React library uses the class name attribute instead of class. So it doesn't make your code stop running, but it is a warning, and it tells you, hey, you should just rename these class names. What the React library will do is take anything with the class name property and turn it into a class property. So all of these drawings that have class on it, right? Theoretically, to make it React friendly, I would just want to add, I just will want to call it class name like this. And the same logic will still apply, right? The class name will turn into a class, and our CSS, which was already styling those particular things, right? It's styling elements, it's styling classes, right? All this CSS still holds. So I'm still able to make use of the CSS that I had before, even though now I'm working with React. And so this gets into a little bit more about styling in React, but we'll talk a lot more about styling and all that in a bit. Just wanted to point out that, hey, you know, we're still getting this really nice looking board. And the reason why is because React is able to tie to our CSS selectors as well. All right, boom. So let's add this logical stuff to our code so that we can actually get it working and get things interactive, right? So now we need to just add the game logic that we had in our main.js to our app.js. And to do that, let's just do a super quick code review of what's going on here. It's going to be easy because I kept some comments in here when I first did this that speak to what are the particular sections of this JavaScript doing, right? There's a couple different sections to our JavaScript file based on what we were coding in this Tic Tac Toe game. The first is this kind of section that were labeled constants. These are just constant values in the code that are going to be used for something. In this case, the winning combos is just a variable that holds an array of all the possible combinations of a winning game of Tic Tac Toe. The second section is the app state variables. So like these state variables are just kind of things that are going to be updated over the course of the data of the JavaScript running to make our game change, right? These state variables, funny, right? They were just called state variables in the way that we built that Tic Tac Toe out, but these are the same variables that we will need to use state, like in the React state sense, in order to make our game dynamic and update things over time. Because clearly the board is a piece of data that needs to change over time, right? So is turn, so is the win. All these things need to change, and the data inside of them might need to change. So we might need to use state in the component in order to keep track of this. Third are these cached element references. So remember, in our game, in the version of Tic Tac Toe before, when we were just using regular JavaScript, we needed to get all of the squares from the board in order to figure out which square got clicked and to update that particular square, right? We need a way to connect to all the different elements. Similar to that, we also need to add these like event listeners and click stuff and all these things to the different parts of our board and the parts of our game in order to update them, right? And then we have some functions. We have a function for calculating if somebody won, right? Get winner. We have a function that runs every time somebody clicks. That's called handle turn. That essentially says, hey, you know, take a look at what square got clicked, update the board, and see if there's a winner and update the board, right? The initialize function starts the board at empty and renders that board. And the render function basically takes the value of whatever's inside of this array for the board, right? And eventually this board array starts empty, but it starts getting values like X and O and X or C, X and O and X, right? But as these values change in the board variable, right, the render function uses those array methods to go through each of the items in the board and make sure that the squares have those particular marks. And then it makes sure that the content of the H1 also has the particular things that it needs to have as well. So that's how the game was working previously, right? And we need this logic in order to make our game work in JavaScript. So let's take it one step at a time and add these various things to our code. And we can talk about what things we'll need and what things React will actually simplify for us. First thing is, okay, winning combinations. Well, we kind of need these. These winning combinations hold all the possible values of in the board like this, which sections or combinations are winning combinations. So I actually will still make use of this. And so I'm going to go ahead and in the app.js, before I declare my function, I'm just going to put that constant back in there, right? Winning combos. So now I have access to a piece of data I can use to cross-reference if somebody won the game. Next thing we had in here were the app state variables. So remember, these are variables like the board or the turn or a win. And these are things that are going to not only, right, determine, these things are going to change, but they're going to determine what the rest of the app needs to look like, right? The board is literally going to determine what the rest of my app needs to look like. The turn is going to change the little message up here, right? So if the turn is different, this should be different, right? And then the win is when I know, hey, the whole board needs to shut down because nobody can play no more because the game has been won, right? So these three variables represent like big changes in the state of our application. That's how you should think about it, right? If the state of the board is different, that means like an X is here, an O is here, right? The state of the board is different. So we want it to update. The same thing holds true for the turn, right? The state of the turn determines who's playing at any given point in time. It also changes things like, am I going to see an X or an O or whatever? In the state of, hey, is the game in a state where someone won? If the game is in a state where someone's won, I'm going to want the game to change how it works versus if the game is in a state where somebody has not won, right? Hopefully you get what I'm saying in the context of how these types of values are going to change how our entire application functions. And we can still refer to them as app state variables, but in the React context, whenever we have variables that are going to be a part of what we call the app state, those are going to be part of our components. So I'm going to I put the constant winning combos outside of the function. I could have put it inside, but because it's not really related to the component itself particularly, I left it outside. I could put it inside. Nothing would change. But for the app state values, I do want these to be part of my component because the component needs to have reference to these values in order to change specific things. And we'll see in a second what we're going to have to do to change that. Cached element references. Now, here's where React helps us so much, right? In regular JavaScript, right, I have to always query the document for the elements I want to change. In React, those elements are JSX. They're just right here in my JavaScript code, right there. You know what I'm saying? Here's all my squares. Here's my board, right? Here's my H1. Like all the code, all the elements are in my JavaScript code. So I don't actually have to select them or find them because they're right here. I just got to figure out what do I want to do with them? How do I want them to logically work and pass that JSX props and state and those types of data things in order to make it work the way I want. So I actually don't need to have this cached element references. So I can skip this. And then event listeners, right? In regular JavaScript, I got to do a pretty long looking thing to add event listeners. One of the most important event listeners for playing Tic Tac Toe clearly is the click, right? I need to make sure I know when the board gets clicked. That's like number one, right? Well, in React, it makes that super simple, right? In order to make any JSX element, right? In a JSX element, I want to make a clear difference. JSX elements are these little lowercase elements here that resemble HTML. A component is a capital letter function that returns JSX, right? So don't confuse JSX with the component itself. A component is by nature JSX because it returns some JSX, but when we talk about JSX, we're talking about these like lowercase HTML looking like elements. Any piece of JSX in React has the ability to add event handling to it, right? So if I want to say, hey, I want this div, this board to be clickable, right? Before I keep clicking the wrong thing. before I had to like find that element, then add the event listener, and then add the function that event listener is going to do. But in this case, it's in React and JSX. It's as simple as going to the JSX element and adding a new attribute with that particular event in it. In my case, it's the on-click handler. And the on-click event handler allows me to say, hey, this JSX element will receive clicks. The on-click handler, just like we did in our event handler in the main, it takes in a function that will be called whenever a click takes place. So in this case, I might have a function like handle turn in order for this div for the board to get clicked and to do stuff, right? So boom. So now clearly I need that handle turn function in my code somewhere for this to work how it needs to work. And matter of fact, just to make it even clearer that all this could be done in React, I'm going to move this from the top and just actually put it in the function. Like I said, there's no real difference. Just putting it in there now so that we all see. So now all this is still happening from the function itself. We have this handle turn function is defined underneath here as a function, right? So I'm going to just go ahead, bring the handle turn function in here and say, okay, cool. So just like I had like the constant, the variables here, I'm going to just, before I return my JSX, I'm going to just define that handle turn function. That way now, when I call handle turn down here, it has a handle turn function here to reference. So this handle turn function is by nature going to allow our board to process a click. Before we get into like the super complex logic of it, I'm just going to comment this out and I'm just going to add a simple alert and say clicked to just make sure that my board is clickable. So to do that, now the page reloads and boom, when I click, I get this nice little alert that says, hey, you clicked, right? So clearly my board is clickable and that's great. Quick 1 second for y'all. I had to put a note in the chat for y'all, but I'm gonna keep going. So right now I'm handling the click and that's allowing me to say, cool, boom. Like now my project is, my board itself is being able to be clicked. That's like a huge first step in the tic-tac-toe space, right? Other than that, right, we have a couple other functions left in here, right? We have the get winner function, which again, I might need this function in order to declare somebody as a winner. So I'm going to go ahead and also put that in my little component here. So I have a function to declare who's a winner. And we had a couple other functions in here as well. We had an init function and a render function. Now, here again is where React gets super dope, right? Well, init function, what was this really doing for us? This function was just saying, hey, take the board and set it to a default value. Okay, well, there's a way we can do that in React very easily. But then it calls this render function. And the render function is a function that every time it gets called, it's going to update what the board looks like. It's going to use what the board data has to update the squares inside of it. Now, this is literally what React was built to make easier. It's made it easier for us to re-render all of the JSX when things like the state get updated. Whenever the state changes, remember I showed you in that before, whenever the state in a React application changes, the page can reload and without refreshing the window, right? So the page can add and show different data without the window itself having to reload. So React actually is going to take care of like the rendering for me because every component, when you return JSX, what you're doing with that JSX is by nature rendering it onto the screen. That's what React is built to do. Is every piece of JSX you write in the return statement is being rendered into your code. So here is where things get interesting, right? And without giving it all away, right? This is where React really shines, right? So what we're going to be able to do now is take the logic from these functions and really just make them easier to do with React. So the first one is the handle turn. Let's go ahead and do that because we want to see our game actually show clicks and stuff. Well, instead of alerting the user when a click happens, I just want to think, okay, boom, what's happening in this function? Well, this function is taking a look at the squares. Remember, there was a variable called squares that we had a reference to. It was taking all my squares, right? So it's like, look at all the squares and find the index of the square where the index is equal to the event.target, right? And it was doing all of this just to get back the index number or a specific unique ID, if you will, for each square, right? Well, this is kind of interesting. Well, one, we don't actually have a squares reference right now in our code. We didn't bring a cached element reference, but we do have all the squares down here, right? Well, what we might really want to do is just say, okay, can I get back which square was targeted by the event? And the reality is with React, you can do that super easily, right? Every event handling function in React, whether it's on click, on drag, on hover, whichever event function you pass in as a handling function, so in my case, it's handle turn, this event function will pass some data to that particular handling function. And that data is wrapped in an object that we call event. So the event still exists. We're still able to pass the event data down into this function, but we still don't have like a squares, like array of squares to make use of to make this work. Well, now let's think about how this really is all working. Well, the reality is that the board is kind of rendering all of the squares, and over time, right, if we look back at like that render function that we saw before, it is saying, hey, you know, go through the board and render the squares, right? So what if we could just render the squares ourselves? Whoops. What if we could just render the squares ourselves and use the data inside of the board to do that, right? Well, with React, we can make that very simple. So here's how we're going to do that. First, we have this board as a piece of data, right? Technically, the board later becomes kind of like this array of 9 kind of empty strings that will represent the moves 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, right? So we can technically use this board to say, okay, I'm going to render whatever's inside of this array of boards of the board, right? And use that to create my squares. And the way we can do that is similar to what we were doing already in the main.js with this render function. But again, we don't use render functions in React. The return statement of a function is by nature its render statement. So theoretically, what I'm doing here is taking the board, and for every element in the board, I am creating a new square with a particular mark. Well, we can do that exact same thing in React here. Instead of having to create these elements off the fly like this, like just hard coded, we can actually use some JavaScript. So I can open some curly braces to use some JavaScript. And I can do something like say, hey, take the board and map through the board, right? And the map is an array method that will say, okay, go iterate through this particular array, right? I'm gonna pass a function, an arrow function in here, just so I have a function to call. And in the arrow function, I get to define 2 things for the array map. One thing will be like what I want to have as data, right? So I could just say data, and I also can get an index number for each element inside of the board. So here I can say, oh, for every element inside of the board, let's return one of our divs for the squares. I just deleted them, but there was div ID, or no, I had to have been class name equals square, and probably closing brace like this, right? And each square, right, when it gets returned, we have the opportunity to pass it the data from the board. So that's exactly what I'm gonna do. So in the curly braces inside of the div, I'm just going to say, hey, take the data from the board and create the square. And so now that's working there. I can also give this particular div a key to make sure that it has kind of like a unique value that is unique to each square, right? In this case, each square's div will have a key, a particular index number for the key, right? Well, this will allow me now to, inside of like methods like handle turn, I can make reference of any of the events that get triggered from this being clicked and use the key of that particular element to say, hey, you know, I want to update this particular square was what got clicked. So when the board handle turn gets triggered, we will know the target is the same target that we were trying to find before. But now we don't have to do all of this extra stuff. We can just look at the event.target. So we know that eventually the square that was triggered, that triggered the click, is going to be what's here in the event.target. So all I really want is this ID. So I can do something like let ID equal the event.target.key, right? And then this way, this should by nature say, hey, this event, this was the targeted element, and that targeted element has this particular key, this index. So we now are returning that targeted element's key as the index. And by doing that, theoretically, the rest of this code should work, minus like some of the stuff. We don't have a render function, so we can get rid of this. And the win equals get winner. Well, technically, let's work on that in a second, right? So I'll save this and let's just take a look and see if any of those changes actually help our code run how we expect. And right now, it doesn't look like so, but let's take a look at the console to just make sure there's no little errors, because sometimes there are. Okay, doesn't look like there's any errors per se, but let's do this and then console.log event.target and see what happens when we click. So I clicked and okay, cool. I get the square back, but here's something that takes place. Well, the key doesn't actually exist in the thing. So instead of giving it a key or naming that attribute the key, I can also give this like an ID, right? And pass the ID with index, right? And make it so that each square has a unique ID as the index. By doing that, I think, and then instead of using event.target.key, let's just do event.target.id. And I think that should work for the use case we're trying to get at here. So when this finally loads, I want to see this. And okay, ID 0, ID 0. I think this is bugging a little bit. Okay, so it's clicking, we get the IDs, but how could I forget? I gotta forget. Well, it's clicking, we're getting the IDs, but we're not seeing the board update the way that we would like. This is just the last piece that's really important to understand with how React works, right? If I want the window to update, right? I need something that will tell this JSX, hey, update yourself, right? Because there's been a change. In order to do that, I can't just use regular values like this. These values don't tell the JSX, hey, update. In order to have this value update itself, I need to make sure that this is using state, the React use state stuff, right? So here, to do that, I'm going to just add React use state around this particular piece of data. And instead of let board, I'm just going to say const board, and remember set board, right? It's going to be the function to change it. And React use state should hold the value of our board. It'll hold the state of our board, right? In this case right now, right, whenever the handle turn gets called, you see how it was trying to update the board, but it never really told the screen to update based on the turn. So what I want to do is I wanted to say, hey, now that we have the idea of the square that got triggered, I want the board and at that particular index to update. And when the board updates, I want this function that was creating all of our squares to also rerun and run with that new change to the square. This is the tricky thing about how React works that you need to understand, which is that you use the state in order to update what shows up on the screen. To do that, we have now this function set board that we can use to change this array up, right? So to do that, what we're going to do is we're going to go here. And the way that the set state works is I literally call the function. It's kind of like this, right? But I need to have some data to pass into the function in order to update, right? So for me, what'll be the easiest is to keep a reference to create a new reference to a new board, right? And the new board will get like the old version of the board first, but then we can say, hey, new board at the index is going to get that particular person's turn. Then we can set the board with the data that's inside of the new board. And by doing this, we should see at least some of the changes happen that will allow for our game to work the way we would expect. And let me make sure I do this. Let's try this. Make sure there's no little. All right, cool. So let me explain what I had to just change in order to get this to work. So basically, I want the value of the new board to be an array with all of the elements that the old board contained. This syntax is essentially saying, give me a new element, right? It's going to be an array, and it's going to have all of the elements that are inside of this particular array. This is also called array spread. This is an array spreading. So you see these three dots are saying, take all the elements from 0 to the end of this array and create a new array and set that equal here. So by doing this, right, just by doing this and setting up a new board and using the state that we just created here for the state of our board, we're now able to actually create the Tic Tac Toe interface and the clicks that we are expecting. The thing that's not working right now is the turns, handling the turns and being able to say, well, whose turn is it now, and updating this. To do that, right, I have to also consider changing this from a regular variable to also be a state variable, and change these functions accordingly to know whose turn is it at any given point in time, right? To do that real quick, and this will just be our last little section on this, right? Instead of having let turn equal X be a static variable, again, I'm going to turn this into a React state. So I'm going to say React use state, and it's going to start with X. And instead of turn by itself, I'm going to say turn and set turn. And now we have a turn. We can still use turn like we were using it, but now we have this set turn that will actually update the state of the turn and update our code visually so we can see some changes. So in the handle turn, right, we want the new board to get whoever's turn it was previously. But here you see what we were trying to do was set the turn to be whoever the other person's turn was, right? So I'm going to just do like I did before and create a new variable. I'm going to say let next turn get turn, and or I could do something like this. I could say let next turn get, and this is a ternary expression. So this is essentially an if else statement in one line. Essentially this statement that I highlighted is saying, is the turn equal to X? Is the turn equal to X? If it is true, the turn now should be O, or if it's else, it should be X. So this is, you could rewrite this as a if else statement, but that's just doing it in one line. So it's checking what the turn was. If is the turn equal to X? If it was, now the new turn should be O, or it should be X. So now that I have next turn, I can set the turn to be next turn. And that just kind of keeps it a little bit easier to read. And I believe just this change should make it so that when we reload, right, it should go from X to O to X to O. Dope. Only other thing left to do, which is related to this, is now that I have a variable holding whose turn it is, right, I can actually pass that variable into this JSX. And so I'm going to do that by just adding some curly braces. And instead of saying X, I'm just going to say its turn, because remember, I have now in the state of value for turn that's set to some value. So this will say it's X's turn or it's O's turn. And because we have this set turn updating, this should also update based on whose turn it is. So finally, we go ahead and we should have a complete version of our game where X, okay, is O's turn. Boom. It's X's turn. All right, boom. O's turn, right? X's turn, O's turn, right? Etc. Now, theoretically, the last step to fix this up in proper form would be to make it so now we can also, when we handle the turn, we can calculate if there's been a winner. To do that, there's a couple small tweaks we will have to make, right, in order to check to see whether or not a winning combo was won. And if there was a winning combo, we would want to see, we would want to return whether or not it's X or O that won, or if it's a tie or if it's null, right? So the get winner function actually still kind of works. So we can still use this. We're going to say win equals get winner. But what this is doing too, remember, is we have this app state, and the win here is meant to be kind of, we're trying to hold to see if there's a winner. And if there is a winner, then realistically what we would want to do is just kind of stop the game from playing, right? Well, in order to just fix this up, ultimately what we want to do is say, hey, if there's a winner, what do we want to do, right? If the game is playing and somebody wins, like, what should happen, right? Well, just taking a look at the logic here, I don't think there was much going on outside of just changing the message. Basically, if we look back at it and say, what was the game doing, right? All it was doing was rendering a message based on if there was a winner, right? And that's all we can do now, and to finish up our game, to just say, hey, somebody won, right? So to do that, all I want to do is say, okay, well, instead of this saying it's X's turn or whatever, I might want to actually have a different message if somebody else has won, right? And to do that, I can make use of what we already have talked about a little bit with React, is create another component. So in my case, what I could do is say, okay, let's just create a new function component called message. And the message is going to return some JSX, just like we have here. So I'm just going to take this. But the difference is, because this is, because we want to use this component in order to show something unique, right? We can actually do, because this is a JavaScript function, we can actually use JavaScript to do some interesting stuff, like if else statement, right? So if we have, if there's a win, right? If somebody won, then we can return something, right? Else, we can return something else. So long as all of this code that is returned is JSX, then our component will be happy, because there's always some JSX that will return. And you can see we're still leveraging the term that is defined inside of our component here. So basically, if there's a winner, I just want to return that message that we had before, right? Or I could do something like this, right? Let's just copy this and say, let's copy this and do this. So instead of this, let's just say, let message get, and again, this is like a one line, if else statement. So it's saying, hey, get the message back. If there's a win, is the win equal to a tie? If there's a tie, then it's going to return there's a tie. Otherwise, if there's a win, it's going to say so-and-so wins the game. And it's, or if there's not a win, it's going to say it's X's turn, it's O's turn, right? So all we want to do now is return, we want to return our little our little drawing here with the message instead of the kind of defaulted stuff that's going on in there. Now, all I need to do now is instead of calling this H2, I can call my message component. And this should theoretically work. The only thing is that it's going to rely on us having a win, right? So last thing I want to do is just quickly turn this into a state variable. So I'm going to set win and react.use state. And instead of giving this a value, I'm going to start it off with null to say, hey, there's nobody that's won yet. It's not X, it's not O, and it's not a tie. So it's null. And that's great because remember, what this is going to be looking at is the get winner function is going to see if there's a winner. And if there's a winner, it's going to return who's the winner. If there's a winner, it's going to be a tie, or it's going to be null, or it's going to be whoever was the actual winner, right? So cool. So with this, then all I want now is after we get back the winner, I'm gonna just make a variable called who won, and then set win to who won, just like we did before. Set a variable to the return of that, and then just set the actual state. And I think with all of this, my good friends, we should be groovy. Let's see, XO, 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 X. Oh, well, still got some bug in there to troubleshoot. But I'm sure it's related to this function here, related to figuring out like who actually is winning. So in many ways, I could go ahead and figure it all out with y'all right here, but because I want to respect your time, just know, right? Essentially what I want to do is say, okay, well, this function, this is a JavaScript function, get winner, right? So now I just kind of want to know, well, how is this particular function working, right? One thing I like to do when I'm debugging stuff, right, is to say, okay, well, I can have my, I can have a console log to see kind of what's going on in here. Right now we have winning combos. It says for each winning combo, right, it's going to map through to each combo, and it's going to say, hey, if board combo 0 and board combo 0, 1, and 2, right, the winner is board combo, right? So this is going to go through each of the combinations that we have here, right? So this is looking at our board and our combinations and basically trying to determine if the board, which is an array, right? If the board and this particular combination 0, and this board combination 1 and the board combination 2, right? It's a tricky situation. I think here what we want to make sure is that all of this value is equal to a specific value. But like I said, troubleshooting that might take me a quick second. So I don't want to give y'all too much of a headache watching me do all this. But just know, right, this is now a logic problem. Fixing this JavaScript to get our board to really declare the winner and change things up is a matter of figuring out, well, how do I make sure that this get winner function returns the right thing? And when it returns, right, I'm able to set the state of who won to set a winner. And if there is a winner, now I know that my message should update because the message is going to be tied to, is there a winner? Is there a winner, or was there a tie? If there was a winner, it'll let me know who won the game. Otherwise, it'll tell me whose turn it is. So this is working, but just a little logic here isn't. But if I patch a fix, I'll let y'all know what the fix is. But hopefully you still get the point of, now we have a really functioning tic-tac-toe game. We're missing this one little step of declaring a winner on the logic, but our X's and our O's are working, and all of this is realistically kind of the actual part of the tic-tac-toe that was the more important piece for us to see. So yeah, thank you for your time and your attention. If I find that fix, I'll let you know. But if you find a fix, let me know, and I'll be happy to talk about what that is. And yeah, thanks to y'all who stuck around for a little bit, and I appreciate you and your time.